Sarah Martinez clutched her worn leather purse tighter as she stepped into the sterile white halls of the police station. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to mirror the darkness that had consumed her life for the past 3 months. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the front desk, where Officer Jenkins sat typing away at his computer, barely glancing up at her approach. "I need to report something," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt heavy on her tongue, weighted down by weeks of fear and sleepless nights. Officer Jenkins looked up with the practiced expression of someone who had heard it all before. His eyes, tired from years of dealing with complaints both trivial and serious, scanned Sarah's appearance. She was a small woman in her early 30s, with dark circles under her brown eyes and hair that hadn't seen proper care in days. Her clothes, while clean, hung loosely on her frame, suggesting recent weight loss. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" he asked, returning his attention to his computer screen as his fingers continued to dance across the keyboard. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had practiced this conversation in her mind countless times during the drive to the station, but, now that the moment had arrived, the words seemed to scatter like leaves in the wind. "My ex-husband. Marcus Williams, he's been threatening me. Following me. I think he might try to hurt me." The words tumbled out in a rush, as if speaking them quickly would somehow lessen their impact. Officer Jenkins paused his typing for a moment, finally, giving Sarah his full attention. He had heard similar stories dozens of times before, and, while he took them seriously, the protocol was always the same. Documentation, restraining orders, and promises to increase patrols in the area. "Have you filed a restraining order against Mr. Williams?" he asked, pulling out a standard form from his desk drawer. Sarah nodded quickly. "Yes, 2 months ago. But it hasn't stopped him. He knows where I work, where I live. He follows me to the grocery store, sits in his car outside my apartment building. Sometimes he calls and doesn't say anything, just breathes into the phone." As Sarah spoke, her voice began to crack with emotion. The fear that had been building inside her for months was finally finding its voice, and, with it came a flood of memories she had tried so hard to suppress. Marcus had always been controlling during their marriage, but, after their divorce 6 months ago, his behavior had escalated into something far more sinister. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Williams," Officer Jenkins said, not bothering to correct himself about her name. "But, unfortunately, unless he actually threatens you directly or violates the restraining order in a way we can prove, our hands are somewhat tied." Sarah felt her heart sink. This was exactly what she had feared would happen. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling through the dozens of missed calls from Marcus's number, the text messages that came at all hours of the night, and the voicemails that consisted of nothing but heavy breathing or distant traffic sounds. "Look at this," she said, placing the phone on the counter. 47 calls yesterday alone. And these text messages, he says he's watching me, that he knows what I'm wearing, where I go." Officer Jenkins examined the phone with professional detachment. While the behavior was certainly disturbing, it fell into a gray area that was difficult to prosecute. The text messages were vague enough that a good lawyer could argue they were expressions of longing from a heartbroken ex-husband rather than explicit threats. "I can add this to your file," he said finally. "And I'll make sure the patrol officers in your area are aware of the situation. But, excuse me, Ms. Martinez, I have to ask, have you considered staying with family or friends for a while? Sometimes a change of location can help defuse these situations." Sarah shook her head, feeling tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I already tried that. I stayed at my sister's house for 2 weeks, but he found me there too. He sent flowers to her workplace with a note saying he knew I was there. My sister has 2 young children. I couldn't put them at risk." The weight of her isolation pressed down on Sarah like a physical force. Marcus had systematically driven away most of her friends during their marriage, criticizing them until she stopped seeing them, questioning her every outing until it became easier to just stay home. Her family lived in another state, and the few local friends she had left were either too frightened to get involved or unable to provide the kind of protection she needed. "Officer Jenkins," Sarah said, her voice taking on a note of desperate determination. "I need a gun permit. I want to be able to protect myself." The typing stopped completely now. Officer Jenkins looked up at Sarah with a mixture of surprise and concern. Gun permits were a serious matter, requiring background checks, waiting periods, and, in many cases, demonstrated need beyond general fear. Ms. Martinez, that's a significant step. Have you ever handled a firearm before? Do you understand the responsibilities and legal implications involved in gun ownership? Sarah had expected this question. During the sleepless nights of the past month, she had researched everything she could about firearms, self-defense laws, and personal protection. She had even visited a shooting range twice, though she hadn't told anyone about it. I've been to a shooting range. I've taken a basic safety course. I know it's serious, but, Officer Jenkins, I'm running out of options. The restraining order is just a piece of paper. It won't stop him if he decides to. She couldn't finish the sentence. The possibility that Marcus might escalate from stalking to physical violence was too terrifying to voice completely. But, it was there, lurking in the back of her mind every time she heard footsteps behind her on the street, every time her doorbell rang unexpectedly. I understand you're scared, Officer Jenkins said, his tone softening slightly. But, a gun isn't always the answer. In fact, statistics show that firearms in domestic violence situations are more likely to be used against the victim than to protect them. Sarah felt a flash of anger rise in her chest. Easy words from someone who didn't have to check their rearview mirror constantly, who didn't have to vary their route to work every day, who could sleep through the night without jumping at every sound. So what am I supposed to do? She asked, her voice rising slightly. Wait until he actually hurts me before anyone takes this seriously? Wait until I'm a statistic? Other people in the police station waiting area were beginning to look in their direction. Sarah could feel their stares, the mixture of curiosity and discomfort that her situation seemed to evoke in others. She lowered her voice, but the intensity remained. I just want a chance to protect myself. Isn't that my right? Officer Jenkins sighed, recognizing the desperation in Sarah's voice. He had seen too many cases like this over his 15-year career, and he knew that the legal system, while well-intentioned, often moved too slowly to keep pace with escalating domestic situations. The process for a concealed carry permit takes time, he explained. Background check, waiting period, additional safety courses. And, given your situation, you'd need to demonstrate immediate need, which can be difficult to prove legally. Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. Every avenue seemed blocked, every door locked. The system that was supposed to protect her seemed more interested in protecting itself from liability than in ensuring her safety. How long? She asked quietly. Minimum 6 weeks, possibly longer depending on the background check and review process. 6 weeks. Sarah thought about how much Marcus's behavior had escalated in just the past month. 6 weeks might as well be 6 years. As if sensing her thoughts, Officer Jenkins leaned forward slightly. Ms. Martinez, I want you to know that we do take this seriously. I'm going to personally make sure that patrol officers drive by your address more frequently. And, I want you to call 911 immediately if Mr. Williams violates the restraining order in any way. Sarah nodded numbly, though they both knew that by the time police could respond to a call, it might already be too late. The mathematics of domestic violence were cruel and simple. It took only seconds to cause irreparable harm, but minutes for help to arrive. There is one other thing, Officer Jenkins said, lowering his voice. Unofficially, you might want to consider a personal security consultation. There are private companies that specialize in protection services for situations like yours. I can't afford that, Sarah replied immediately. Her divorce had left her with minimal savings, and her job as a medical transcriptionist, while steady, didn't provide the kind of income that could support private security. Some companies offer payment plans or pro bono services for victims of domestic violence. It might be worth looking into. Sarah took the business card he offered, though she doubted it would lead anywhere. The divide between those who could afford protection and those who couldn't seemed as vast as an ocean, with her standing on the wrong shore. As she prepared to leave the police station, Sarah felt the familiar weight of fear settling back onto her shoulders. The bright afternoon sun outside seemed somehow dimmer than when she had entered, and she found herself automatically scanning the parking lot for Marcus's blue sedan. It wasn't there, but that provided little comfort. Marcus had proven remarkably adept at surveillance, often knowing her movements without being visible himself. Sometimes Sarah wondered if he had installed some kind of tracking device on her car, though multiple inspections by mechanics had found nothing. Walking to her own car, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities and contingencies. She could move again, maybe to another city, but that would mean leaving her job, her life, starting over completely with no guarantee that Marcus wouldn't follow her again. She could try to reason with him, but their last conversation, 3 months ago, had ended with him screaming threats that still echoed in her nightmares. The drive home took her through downtown, past the courthouse where their divorce had been finalized, past the restaurant where they had celebrated their first anniversary, past all the landmarks of a relationship that had started with hope and ended in fear. Sarah tried not to look at these places, but they seemed to pull her attention like magnets, reminding her of how dramatically her life had changed. Her apartment building came into view, a modest 3-story structure with aging brick facade and small balconies overlooking the street. Sarah had chosen it specifically because it had controlled access and good lighting in the parking area, but now those security features felt inadequate against someone who knew her routine as well as Marcus did. As she pulled into her assigned parking space, Sarah noticed a car she didn't recognize parked across the street. A small sedan with tinted windows, too dark to see inside. Her pulse quickened as she tried to determine if someone was sitting in the driver's seat, but the angle and window tinting made it impossible to tell. For several minutes, Sarah sat in her car, engine running, watching the mysterious vehicle. This was what her life had become: constant vigilance, endless analysis of every unfamiliar sight or sound. She felt like a prey animal, hyper-aware of every shadow that might conceal a predator. Finally, she gathered her courage and made the quick walk to her building's entrance, keys ready, constantly glancing over her shoulder. The car remained motionless, giving no indication of whether it posed a threat or was simply an ordinary vehicle belonging to someone visiting the neighborhood. Inside her apartment, Sarah immediately went to the window and peered through the blinds at the street below. The sedan was still there, unchanged. She watched it for another 10 minutes before finally stepping away from the window, exhausted by her own paranoia but unable to shake the feeling that she was being observed. The rest of the evening passed in the same pattern that had become routine over the past months. Sarah checked and double-checked the locks on her door and windows, drew all the blinds, and settled in for another night of fitful sleep punctuated by every sound from the street outside. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Sarah thought about Officer Jenkins's words regarding the gun permit. 6 weeks seemed like an eternity when measured against the accelerating pace of Marcus's harassment. But maybe it was her only real option for taking control of her situation. The decision crystallized in her mind with surprising clarity. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of applying for a concealed carry permit. She would take additional safety courses, whatever was required. She would do everything necessary to legally arm herself for protection, regardless of how long it took or how difficult the process might be. For the first time in months, Sarah felt something other than helpless fear. It wasn't hope, exactly, but it was determination. She was tired of being a victim, tired of running, tired of living in constant terror. If the system couldn't protect her quickly enough, she would find a way to protect herself. Outside, the mysterious sedan remained parked across the street, its dark windows reflecting the streetlights like empty eyes watching over the building where Sarah Martinez tried unsuccessfully to sleep, unaware that her fight for survival was about to take a dramatic turn that would test every assumption she had made about her situation and the people who might be willing to help her. The next morning brought no relief for Sarah Martinez. She woke before her alarm, as had become her custom, and immediately went to the window to check if the sedan was still there. It was gone, but that brought little comfort. Marcus had proven unpredictably consistent in his harassment, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, but always present in the background of her life like a malevolent shadow. Sarah's job at Regional Medical Center required her to be at her desk by 8 in the morning, transcribing doctor's notes and medical reports with the kind of precision that left no room for the anxiety that consumed her personal life. For 8 hours each day, she could lose herself in the technical language of medicine, the steady rhythm of typing, the familiar comfort of routine tasks that demanded her complete attention. But the journey to work had become a daily gauntlet of fear and hypervigilance. Sarah had developed the habit of leaving 15 minutes early so she could take a different route each day, constantly checking her rearview mirror for signs of the blue sedan that had haunted her for months. Sometimes she would make unnecessary turns, double back through parking lots, or stop at random businesses just to see if anyone was following her. This particular morning, as she navigated through the downtown traffic, Sarah noticed a motorcycle keeping pace with her car about 3 vehicles back. The rider wore a black helmet with a dark visor, making identification impossible, but something about the way the bike maintained its distance set off her internal alarm system. She made a sudden right turn down a side street, and the motorcycle continued straight, but the incident left her shaken. At work, Sarah's cubicle was positioned near a window that overlooked the employee parking lot, a feature she had initially appreciated but now viewed with mixed emotions. She could see her car from her desk, which provided some sense of security, but it also meant she spent much of the day glancing outside instead of focusing on her work. Her supervisor, Janet Morrison, had noticed the decline in Sarah's productivity over the past months, though she attributed it to personal problems rather than understanding the full scope of the situation. Janet was a kind woman in her 50s who had worked at the medical center for over 2 decades, and she had developed a maternal concern for the younger employees under her supervision. "Sarah, honey, you seem distracted lately," Janet said during the morning break, settling into the chair beside Sarah's desk with a cup of coffee. "Is everything all right at home?" Sarah appreciated Janet's concern, but she had learned to be cautious about sharing details of her situation. Too often, well-meaning people offered advice that revealed how little they understood about the complexities of domestic violence and stalking. They suggested she just ignore him or get over it or not let him control her life, as if fear were a choice she was making rather than a rational response to genuine danger. "Just some personal issues I'm working through," Sarah replied, offering a weak smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Nothing I can't handle." Janet studied Sarah's face with the practiced eye of someone who had seen many employees struggle with personal crises over the years. The dark circles under Sarah's eyes, the way she startled at unexpected sounds, the nervous habit of checking her phone constantly, all pointed to stress that went beyond normal relationship problems. "You know, if you ever need to talk, or if you need some time off to deal with things, the company has resources available," Janet offered gently. "We have an employee assistance program that includes counseling services, and we can arrange flexible scheduling if needed." Sarah felt a wave of gratitude mixed with frustration. The kindness of people like Janet made her feel less alone, but it also highlighted how powerless most people were to actually help with her specific situation. Counseling couldn't stop Marcus from following her, flexible scheduling wouldn't prevent him from showing up at her workplace, and time off might actually make her more vulnerable by disrupting the routines that provided her with some semblance of safety. "Thank you, Janet. I really appreciate that. I'm hoping things will get better soon." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Patterson, one of the senior physicians who frequently required Sarah's transcription services. He was a tall, imposing man with gray hair and an authoritative presence that commanded immediate attention from everyone in the office. "Ms. Martinez, I need yesterday's surgical notes transcribed and sent to the patient's primary care physician by noon," he said brusquely, placing a digital recorder on her desk. "It's a complex case, so accuracy is particularly important." Sarah nodded and reached for the recorder, grateful for the distraction of demanding work. Dr. Patterson had a reputation for being difficult to work with, but his cases were interesting and required the kind of focus that helped quiet the anxiety in her mind. As she worked through the morning, transcribing Dr. Patterson's detailed notes about a complicated orthopedic surgery, Sarah found herself thinking about the gun permit application she planned to submit during her lunch break. She had researched the requirements extensively and had all the necessary paperwork prepared, but she remained uncertain about whether her situation would meet the legal criteria for demonstrating immediate need. The lunch break couldn't come quickly enough. Sarah gathered her purse and the folder containing her application materials, told Janet she would be back in an hour, and headed for the elevator. The county clerk's office where gun permits were processed was only a few blocks away, making it possible to complete the application during her lunch break. Walking through downtown, Sarah found herself automatically scanning the faces of people she passed, looking for Marcus or anyone else who might be watching her. The paranoia had become so ingrained that she often couldn't tell whether her suspicions were justified or whether her mind was creating threats where none existed. The county building was an imposing structure of gray stone and tall windows that spoke of governmental authority and bureaucratic procedure. Inside, the gun permit office was located on the 3rd floor, accessed through a maze of hallways lined with official notices and public service announcements. The clerk behind the counter was a middle-aged woman with steel gray hair and the efficient manner of someone who had processed thousands of similar applications. She glanced up as Sarah approached, taking note of the folder in her hands with professional recognition. "Gun permit application?" she asked without preamble. "Yes, ma'am. I have all the required documents." Sarah spread her paperwork across the counter, the completed application form, copies of her identification, proof of residency, character references, and, most importantly, the documentation of her restraining order against Marcus and the police reports detailing his stalking behavior. The clerk reviewed each document with methodical thoroughness, checking boxes and making notes in margins. When she reached the police reports, her expression became more focused, and she read through them carefully. You're applying under the immediate threat provision, she observed, looking up at Sarah. Based on domestic violence stalking. Yes. My ex-husband has been following me, threatening me. The police reports document his behavior, and I have a restraining order, but it hasn't stopped him. The clerk nodded with the weary recognition of someone who had seen similar cases many times before. Domestic violence applications made up a significant portion of gun permits issued under the immediate threat provision, though proving immediate need often required more documentation than victims possessed. I see you have police reports, but they're mostly about surveillance and harassment rather than explicit physical threats, the clerk noted. The review board looks for evidence of imminent danger when considering expedited applications. Sarah felt her heart sink. This was the same obstacle she had encountered with Officer Jenkins and every other official she had spoken to about her situation. The legal system seemed to require actual violence before it would acknowledge the legitimacy of her fear. He knows where I live and work. He follows me everywhere. The restraining order hasn't stopped him at all, Sarah explained, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. How much more evidence do I need that he might hurt me? The clerk's expression softened slightly. In her years of processing gun permit applications, she had developed an ability to distinguish between paranoid individuals seeking weapons for imaginary threats and genuine victims trying to protect themselves from real danger. Sarah Martinez clearly fell into the latter category. I understand your frustration, the clerk said quietly. The law requires us to be very careful about who gets expedited permits, but your documentation is more thorough than most applications we see. I'll flag this for priority review, which means you should hear back within 3 weeks instead of the standard 6. 3 weeks. Still an eternity when measured against the daily fear that consumed Sarah's life, but better than she had dared hope for when she walked into the building. In the meantime, the clerk continued, I have to ask, do you have a safe place you can stay? Family, friends, somewhere he doesn't know about? Sarah shook her head. I already tried staying with my sister, but he found me there too. And I can't keep putting other people at risk. The clerk made additional notes on the application file, documenting Sarah's efforts to protect herself through other means. This kind of information could be crucial in demonstrating that a gun permit was a last resort rather than a first choice. The application fee is $150, the clerk said, and you'll need to complete the safety course within 2 weeks of approval. There are several certified instructors in the area, and I can give you a list. Sarah paid the fee and accepted the list of safety instructors, though the cost represented a significant portion of her weekly salary. Everything about protecting herself seemed designed to favor people with more resources than she possessed. Walking back to work, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and continued anxiety. She had taken a concrete step toward protecting herself, but the waiting period stretched ahead like an insurmountable obstacle. 3 weeks of continued vulnerability, 3 weeks of looking over her shoulder, 3 weeks of hoping that Marcus's obsession wouldn't escalate into violence. The afternoon at work passed slowly, with Sarah finding it difficult to concentrate on transcription as her mind wandered to thoughts of what she would do if her permit application were denied. The legal system had failed to provide adequate protection, her personal resources were limited, and the options available to her seemed to narrow with each passing day. As quitting time approached, Sarah began the mental preparation for her evening routine of vigilance and fear. The drive home would require the same careful attention to her surroundings, the same analysis of every vehicle that seemed to follow her, the same hyper-aware state that left her exhausted by the end of each day. But, as she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the office, Janet Morrison approached her desk with a concerned expression. Sarah, there was a man here asking about you earlier this afternoon, Janet said quietly. He said he was your brother, but something about him didn't seem right. He wanted to know your schedule, when you usually left work. The blood drained from Sarah's face. Marcus didn't know about her job at the medical center, or at least she had assumed he didn't. She had been working there for only 4 months, starting after their divorce, and she had been careful not to mention it during any of their interactions. What did he look like? Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. Tall, dark hair, maybe mid-30s. He was well-dressed, seemed polite, but when I told him we couldn't give out information about employees, he got a little insistent. Marcus. It had to be Marcus. Somehow he had discovered where she worked, despite all her precautions. The safe haven of her office, the 8 hours each day when she could almost forget about her situation, had been compromised. What exactly did you tell him? Sarah asked, trying to control the tremor in her voice. Nothing. Our policy is very clear about not giving out employee information to anyone, even family members. But, Sarah, he seemed to know an awful lot about you already. He mentioned that you drive a red Toyota, which is parked in our lot right now. The implications of Marcus's visit to her workplace hit Sarah like a physical blow. He wasn't just following her anymore, he was actively investigating her life, talking to people, gathering information. The stalking was becoming more sophisticated, more invasive, more dangerous. Janet, I need to tell you something, Sarah said, looking around to make sure no one else could overhear. That man isn't my brother. He's my ex-husband, and he's been stalking me for months. I have a restraining order against him. Janet's face went pale with shock and concern. In her years of supervising employees, she had dealt with many personal crises, but active stalking cases were fortunately rare in their workplace. Oh my God, Sarah. Why didn't you tell me? We need to call security, call the police. He wasn't threatening anyone here, and he didn't actually break any laws by asking about me, Sarah replied wearily. The police already know about my situation. There's not much they can do unless he actually violates the restraining order in a provable way. Janet sat down heavily in the chair beside Sarah's desk, processing this new information. The medical center had security procedures for dealing with workplace violence, but those protocols were designed for random threats rather than targeted stalking of specific employees. We need to inform building security about this, Janet said firmly. They should have a photo of this man and instructions not to let him into the building. And I want you to start using the employee entrance instead of the main entrance. It's closer to the security desk. Sarah appreciated Janet's immediate response and practical suggestions, but she also felt the familiar weight of imposing her problems on other people. Now her coworkers and supervisor would have to be vigilant, security would have to be alerted, and the normal functioning of the workplace would be disrupted because of her personal situation. I'm so sorry about this, Janet. I never wanted to bring this kind of problem to work. Don't you dare apologize, Janet replied firmly. This is not your fault, and we're going to do whatever we can to help keep you safe here. Tomorrow I'll speak with building management about upgrading our security procedures. As Sarah finally prepared to leave for the day, she felt a new level of vulnerability. If Marcus knew where she worked, he might also know her schedule, her usual route home, her daily patterns. The limited sense of security she had maintained through careful planning and varied routines had been shattered by his appearance at her workplace. The walk to her car seemed longer than usual, and Sarah found herself looking at every face in the parking lot, every vehicle that might contain a watching presence. Her red Toyota, which had once represented independence and mobility, now felt like a beacon advertising her location to anyone who might be tracking her movements. The drive home was a nightmare of hypervigilance and second-guessing. Every car that turned when she turned, every motorcycle that appeared in her mirrors, every driver whose face she couldn't clearly see became a potential threat. By the time she reached her apartment building, Sarah was emotionally exhausted and physically tense from the constant state of alert. But, as she pulled into her parking space, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. There, tucked under her windshield wiper, was a single red rose with a note attached. Her hand shook as she got out of the car and retrieved the flower, knowing that Marcus was the only person who would leave such a thing. The note was written in Marcus's familiar handwriting, "You look beautiful when you're working. I'm so proud of the job you're doing. Love always, M." The message was disturbing on multiple levels. It confirmed that Marcus knew where she worked, that he had been watching her there, and that he felt comfortable enough to approach her car in the parking lot of her apartment building. The restraining order prohibited him from contacting her directly, but the note stopped just short of explicit violation by not containing threats or demands. Sarah stood in the parking lot, holding the rose and note, feeling more vulnerable and exposed than she had since this entire nightmare began. Marcus was escalating his behavior, becoming bolder, getting closer. The walls she had built around her life were crumbling faster than she could rebuild them. Inside her apartment, Sarah called Officer Jenkins to report the incident. As expected, he took down the information but explained that the note, while disturbing, didn't constitute a clear violation of the restraining order. He promised to document the incident and increase patrols in her area, but both he and Sarah knew how limited those measures really were. That night, as Sarah lay in bed listening to every sound from the street outside, she thought about the gun permit application sitting in some clerk's office, working its way through a bureaucratic process that moved far too slowly for her rapidly deteriorating situation. 3 weeks seemed like an impossibly long time to wait for the ability to protect herself. She also thought about Janet's kindness, Officer Jenkins's limited but genuine efforts to help, and the clerk's promise to expedite her application. There were good people trying to help her within the constraints of systems that weren't designed to move quickly enough to keep pace with escalating danger. But, most of all, Sarah thought about the note from Marcus and what it represented. He was no longer content to watch from a distance or make anonymous phone calls. He was inserting himself directly into her life, making his presence known, claiming ownership of her space and her activities. Tomorrow would bring another day of hypervigilance, another day of carefully planned routes and constant checking over her shoulder. But it would also bring her one day closer to the moment when she might finally have the means to defend herself, one day closer to reclaiming some control over her life. As sleep finally came, fitful and interrupted by dreams of pursuing shadows and locked doors, Sarah Martinez held on to the hope that somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery of permits and background checks, her application was moving forward, bringing her closer to the protection she desperately needed. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah Martinez submitted her gun permit application, and Marcus Williams had escalated his campaign of psychological terror with surgical precision. The rose on her windshield had been followed by a series of increasingly intimate violations of her privacy that demonstrated just how thoroughly he had infiltrated every aspect of her daily existence. He knew her new morning routine, appearing at the coffee shop where she had started stopping before work, always sitting 3 tables away, never approaching, just watching with the patient intensity of a predator studying its prey. He knew about her grocery shopping habits, somehow anticipating which store she would visit and leaving small gifts, flowers, or notes on her car windshield that were always carefully worded to avoid explicit threats while making his presence undeniably clear. Most disturbing of all, Marcus had somehow obtained her new cell phone number, despite her having changed it twice in the past month. The calls came at irregular intervals, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes during her lunch break, always silent except for the sound of breathing and distant traffic that let her know he was mobile, watching, following. Sarah's world had contracted to a series of defensive routines that governed every moment of her waking life. She varied her routes to work using a complex rotation she had mapped out on her kitchen table, alternating between 7 different paths that took her through busy commercial districts where witnesses would be plentiful if Marcus chose to make his move. She shopped for groceries at different stores on different days, never establishing a pattern that could be predicted or anticipated. But, despite all her precautions, Marcus seemed to stay one step ahead of her, demonstrating an understanding of her habits and preferences that spoke to months of careful surveillance. He knew she preferred the pharmacy on 5th Street over the chain store near her apartment. He knew she usually bought coffee from the independent shop rather than the corporate chains. He knew her clothing preferences, her favorite parking spots, even which entrance she used at the medical center. The psychological toll was becoming unbearable. Sarah had lost 12 pounds since the stalking began, her appetite destroyed by constant anxiety. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by every sound from the street outside, every creak of the building settling, every distant siren that might signal that Marcus had finally crossed the line from psychological torture to physical violence. At work, Janet Morrison had become an unofficial bodyguard, walking Sarah to her car each evening and arriving early each morning to make sure the parking lot was clear before Sarah's shift began. The building security had been briefed about Marcus, and his photograph now hung in their office with instructions to call police immediately if he appeared on the property. But these protective measures felt increasingly inadequate against someone who had proven capable of gathering information and maintaining surveillance without being detected. Sarah lived with the constant awareness that Marcus was out there somewhere, watching, planning, waiting for the perfect moment to make his next move. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when Sarah returned home from work to find her apartment door standing slightly ajar. Her hands trembled as she approached the entrance to her building, knowing that something was fundamentally wrong but unable to comprehend the full scope of what she was about to discover. The building's security system required a keycard for entry, and Sarah had been careful to never share her access code with anyone, including Marcus, during their marriage. But, somehow, someone had gained entry to the building and to her specific apartment. The door showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting that whoever had been inside possessed either sophisticated lockpicking skills or copies of her keys. Sarah stood in the hallway for several minutes, too frightened to enter her own home but unwilling to leave without knowing what had happened inside. Finally, she called 911, explaining her situation to the dispatcher and requesting immediate police assistance. Officer Jenkins arrived within 10 minutes, accompanied by a younger officer Sarah hadn't met before. They approached the apartment with professional caution, hands resting on their service weapons as they slowly pushed open the door and began clearing each room. "Clear," Officer Jenkins called out after several minutes of tense searching. "But, you need to see this, Ms. Martinez." Sarah entered her apartment to find a scene that was both subtle and deeply disturbing. Nothing appeared to have been stolen or damaged, but